Listen, to calculate the surface of a penguin, a physicist would assume that it's cylindrical. So it's okay to talk about point lights, point sources, and spheres today. Why? Physics. And you have probably heard from the inverse squared law. Finnish darkness from the outside proportional to the inverse distance squared. 25%, 1000 lux. In 1 meter, it's about 3 feet, or like 11 sausages, or like 6/8 of a mid-sized dog, is a single point spitting rays of light which don't exist, so it's spitting photons in every single direction. Today I'll show that if you want a darker background, you need a stronger light closer to you, and I'll explain you why. And for the impatient one, here it goes again. Given that you want to expose your subject, my face in this case, well, let's assume, which is the first assumption, that there is some ambient light and that you want a darker background. What you will need is have a stronger light and get it closer to the subject. So now for the longer explanation, especially since it feels quite counterintuitive that in order to get a darker background you need more light. And this is especially worse if you're sitting on this room and you actually can see that the background is getting a lot more light when I crank this up. So how can it be that to get it darker I need more light here? Why? Physics. This longer explanation is divided in 2 chunks. I'm going to put the timestamps so you can choose whichever is more relevant for you or you want to hear it. One will be the relevance and the impact of the ambient light in all this equation. If you will be in a perfectly dark background and environment, this doesn't matter anymore. But I don't think anyone has that one. And then a little bit of simplified math and physics to explain why these calculations go as they do. And in the end, it all boils down to ratios. So the difference between the light that is hitting me, the subject in the foreground, and the light that is hitting the background, including the ambient light. But first, let's go through my setup. So today we're shooting at ISO 640 f2.8, 1/50, 25 frames per second, and we are in the Thomann 20 to 40mm mounted on a ZV-E1, and we are shooting in S-Log3. This will not change throughout this video, so to change the exposure, to change the darkness of the background, to change the illumination, we're going to be then adjusting the light, which is the Godox ML100 PI, and then we'll be using ND filters in the camera. And you have probably heard from the inverse squared law. So let's take a quick look at it. Basically, it says that the intensity of the source light in our case is proportional to the inverse distance squared. And that's the distance between the source and the subject. So the farther you go, the less intense it is. That's the proportional ratio. And you can look at it this way as well. The relationship between, or ratio between 2 intensities, which is the division of intensity 1 divided by intensity 2, is the same than the inverse of the ratio of the distances to the source squared. But if it's just about the ratios, then it doesn't matter how much light there is in the source, because the intensity will be just the division and the ratios. So the ratio between foreground and background will be the same. And as long as you expose using NDs or however you do it, the difference, perception difference between the foreground and the background should be exactly the same, right? Well, I'm glad you asked. The answer is simple, and it's something that most of us can't get away from, which is ambient light. So now we're making an assumption, which is a fair one, and it's that some ambient light exists in your scene. In my case, is a little bit of Finnish darkness from the outside, this practical light, and another practical light. So that's our ambient light that affects pretty much everything in this room. In this case, the practicals are affecting more the background than the foreground, but let's assume that ambient light would be affecting everything the same in here. We're going to be assuming a lot of things in this video today, by the way. And now, continuing with the assumptions, I'm just going to make up some numbers to illustrate my point. Let's say that your light source is at 25%, and with that is hitting the subject, so my face, in the foreground at 1000 lux, which lux is a unit of luminance per surface. That foreground is, in this case, how far away I am from the light source. It's on 1 meter, so my face is 1 meter away from the light source. That's about 3 feet, or like 11 sausages, or like 6/8 of a mid-sized dog, in case you don't like international system and metric units. But the background is at 3 meters, which is a bunch of feet. So if the light is hitting me at 1,000 lux at 1 meter, it means that it's hitting the background at about 111 lux. If the foreground, now we switch the light and we put it at 1%, let's assume, and it's hitting my face at 100 lux, then it's hitting the background at 11. If we crank it up, and it will be hitting my face at 10,000 lux, remember I'm making up those numbers, then the background would be at 1,111. And the ratio between foreground and background is the same in all of those 3 cases. It's around 10. But now let's say that the ambient light, is it because of the practicals or because of the sun, or it's just not dark enough in here, we have 200 lux everywhere in the room. Then you would have something like this. So now, because we have this 200 lux everywhere, it affects the foreground, but also the background. And now, the less illumination we have initially, the more impact has the ambient light. And you can see that the ratios that a moment ago, they were exactly the same, independent of the strength of the source, because it was just a ratio. Now they're heavily impacted by the ambient light. Because of the ambient light, a weaker source illuminates a bit the foreground, but the background is still mostly illuminated by ambient light. So the ratio between my face and the background is much smaller. With a much stronger source, like right now, you're basically making the ambient light almost irrelevant. And that's what makes the background seem darker. And right now, this is super bright. It's actually kind of blinding me, and I have to use an ND in order to get this light cranked up this much, but that's how it works. And now, if you were wondering if the math is mathing and why this formula is like this, so that the proportions between intensity is the same than the inverse proportion of distances squared. So let's take a look at it. Let's say that the intensity 1 in this formula is the foreground and the intensity 2 is the background. So how much light does the foreground, my face in this case, gets versus how much then the background gets. If you want the foreground to get 4 times more light or more intensity than the background, the distances would be double of each other. So if now I'm 1 meter away, then the background would have to be 2 meters in order to have 4 times the intensity. If I would be 2 meters away from the light, then the background would have to be 4 meters away from me to get 4 times the intensity. So this basically tells us that the bigger the difference between these 2 distances and the source, the difference in intensity grows exponentially with an exponent of 2. And since we're here, maybe let's explain why that is so. So you need to imagine that our light source, or the light source that you're using, is a single point spitting rays of light which don't exist. So it's spitting photons in every single direction. The foreground is a sphere that is covering, or that has the light source exactly in the center, and the radius of that sphere is the distance from the source to the foreground. And what would be then the background? Another sphere which is much bigger and farther away, or has a bigger radius. And given that we have that point source of light and those 2 spheres around it, the light intensity that hits a portion of the sphere would be kind of the amount of photons that hit a certain surface area. Kind of light per square meter or square sausage. So the ratio or the proportion is literally the ratio and proportion between the 2 areas given the spread of that cone or whatever shape you are spreading around. Since the area of a sphere is 4 pi radius squared, the ratio between those 2 is just the division, so it's 1 radius squared divided by the other radius squared, therefore the formula. If you would, I chose the whole sphere, but if you pick any shape that comes out from the source, the division would be the same, because the formula for that particular surface area on top of that sphere would be the same. The difference would be only the radius. And now please hold your pitchforks and torches, and I know that the source is not the point. And how are we really talking about the sphere if this is... I have an umbrella right now, which is not exactly a sphere. Listen, to calculate the surface of a penguin, a physicist would assume that it's cylindrical. So it's okay to talk about point lights, point sources, and spheres today. And a different way to imagine this is that, imagine that behind the screen right now that you're watching at me, you have a cannon that it can shoot peas, not frozen because it would hurt, so just normal peas. And now if I hold this up here, this is the target. Now, quite many peas, or quite a few peas, would be hitting this paper, and a few would be going away. Now, what happens if I go behind with the same target? Much less peas would be hitting that target. So that's the idea. The farther you are, the smaller you make the target compared to that source, and therefore less light hits it. And how many less peas would hit behind? Well, the ratio would be the difference between the distance between the P cannon and me, the P cannon and the background, those distances squared. So hopefully this explains something. I guess to me the main point is to understand the counterintuitiveness of having a lot more light in order to make a part of the image darker. But it's all about the ratios and relative distances. Hopefully you learned something today. If you did, please like and subscribe. And we'll see you another time with some more content.